All right, it looks like we're ready to go. We've got quite a few folks joining us today. We know we had 500 that registered, but often we get a little bit lower number than that because schedules change and things come up and people just prefer to watch the recording afterwards. So we want to welcome you all to today's session. That's part of a larger series that we are doing that is offering mental health and suicide prevention support and resources in response to the global pandemic. My name is Kelsey Schmitz, and I work for the University of Washington at the School Mental Health Assessment Research and Training Center, or SMART Center. I'm the School Mental Health Lead to the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. Our center is located in Seattle, Washington. In response to the critical need for support during this challenging time, a group of organizations that are based in the Northwest region have quickly formed an alliance to join together and co-develop, co-deliver, co-sponsor, and co-brand content, resources, and a wealth of other information in one spot and give you access to school mental health experts. So the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center and the UW Smart Center are partnering with Forefront Suicide Prevention, the Association of Washington School Principals, Dr. Jim and Liz Mazza, who created DBT in Schools curriculum, Northwest Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports Network, Sound Supports, and Well Educator to bring you the Wellbeing series that's going to offer a variety of virtual learning opportunities for kids, families, and educators focusing on mental wellness and suicide prevention. Today's session is also the 6th and final webinar in our Creating Trauma Responsive Schools webinar series. Today's webinar was originally focused on a different topic, but given our current situations, our amazing partners quickly shifted to the topic of psychological first aid. So you can learn more about the Wellbeing series by visiting the website and checking out the many other events that we have planned. If you have questions, you can reach out to my colleague, Megan Lucy. So on this slide, you can see in the purple box the various events that we have coordinated. Some have already started, some are still going, and we have an amazing team that's able to turn around the recording in just a few days. So many of these series that have webinars that have already taken place, the recordings have already been posted. So we welcome you to join us live for some of these, and we also invite you to check out the recordings. So you can visit that website, the bit.ly link there, Wellbeing Northwest. It is case sensitive, so make sure you type it in just as it's listed there. Megan is also putting some links for you in the chat box, so you can also navigate to the website there as well. So the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center Network was funded by SAMHSA, which stands for the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration, in late 2018. The Mental Health Technology Transfer Center includes 10 regional centers, a National American Indian and Alaska Native Center, a National Hispanic and Latino Center, and a network coordinating office. We know that we have many of you that are joining us from outside our region, and we're glad you're here. We also want you to know that you have some resources in your own backyard, so to speak, and encourage you to reach out to your region school mental health lead for additional support for contextualized resources for your region. So our Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center supports the school mental health workforce in Alaska, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. And these are some photos of our great team. And this is how you can get in touch with our Region 10 Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer School Mental Health Center. You can visit our website, you can sign up for our newsletter, and you can connect with us on our various social media accounts. We do send out monthly newsletters as well as training and resource blasts of any upcoming or new resources that are available. So feel free to sign up for the newsletter. I believe Megan's going to put that link in the chat as well. So as I mentioned earlier, this webinar is the final in a 6-part series on creating trauma responsive schools. It's focused on psychological first aid. This series has garnered a lot of interest this year, and we're really looking forward to partnering with Pamela and Vivian and their colleagues for our year 3 that starts in August. So my final reminder is to first of all give you just a recap of the 6 webinars. Some of you may just be joining us for the very first time, and we want to welcome you to check out all of the other amazing recorded webinars that we've done throughout the school year. So there's a link at the bottom of that slide, and Megan has also put the link to all the recordings in the chat as well. Welcome. We're glad you both are here with us for our final webinar together this year. Can you believe it?
Good morning. I'll go ahead and, do you want to go ahead and start, Pamela, so you can introduce the center as well?
Yeah, so I'll just quickly introduce myself. My name is Pamela Bona, and I am with the University of Southern California School of Social Work, and I am the program manager and a research associate with the Treatment and Services Adaptation Center for Resilience, Hope, and Wellness in Schools. Our center has been a federally funded center for about 20 years, and we've really been charged with developing trauma-informed practices and resources that can be implemented specifically within school systems, because we know the culture of school systems is so unique. And so we've been doing that work for about 20 years, and we're really excited to share with you today the psychological first aid Listen, Protect, Connect model that was developed by our center's director, Dr. Marlene Wong.
So my name is Vivian Villaverde, and I am a clinical associate professor for field education at the same university, USC Suzanne de Borgbeck School of Social Work. And by training, I am a school social worker. So I worked for LA Unified School District for about 10 years prior to coming on board with USC to be a faculty. I work mostly with a lot of our foster care kids as well as probation kids, and so that's been my background. So it was really a privilege, and it's a great transition for me to be a part of the Treatment Services and Adaptation Center. So that's a little bit about myself in a nutshell. And with that, we want to welcome you to our psychological first aid, Listen, Protect, Connect, Model, and Teach training. So psychological first aid was developed along with Dr. Marlene Wong and 2 other colleagues, Dr. Robin Burwich and Chip Schreiber, I believe. And it's with Dr. Wong's permission that we are using it today. And this is also a training that has been endorsed by the U.S. Department of Education. So on the slide or the PowerPoint handout that you have gotten, the link to the to the source or to the web page with the U.S. Department of Education is on this page right here that you can see. Okay. So why PFA? Why is it important? Where there is crisis, there's community disruption and emotional injury. Whatever crisis that might be, whether it's man-made or whether it is natural causes, such as any of the floods that we've had and the fires, and as well as any of the hurricanes. What are some of the things that PFA, psychological first aid, can help provide? It creates a compassionate environment for everyone. What we want to do is create that supportive and environment where individuals can feel connected in order to get supports or just feel that they are connected in terms of the crisis that they're going through. What are the other things that it provides? Assess what someone may need at the moment, and also provide immediate support to those who are in stressful situations. Help others cope in the face of this particular stressful events. And what we wanted to do, or what PFA does, is really try to mitigate by providing immediate supports, connectedness, and resources in order to hopefully mitigate more serious impacts of these experiences down the line. The goals of PFA is, first and foremost, establish physical and emotional safety. I think that is what we wanted to provide in terms of whether it's a student or with each other, our colleagues, ourselves. We want to make sure that we are providing that safe physical and emotional space for them. Stabilize emotions and behavior, be able to engage with those individuals who might be dysregulated at that moment, and hopefully provide them the space to assist them and support them in regulating their emotions. Ultimately, support the return to an improved mental emotional state. And our goal is to really assist and try to usher in the ability to resume education, their respective roles, and re-engage in work and family life. And that includes re-engage with peers, with colleagues, for the students that we have, potentially re-engage in being able to do schoolwork again, whether it is back in the physical sense or engage in some sort of remote learning, if that's, if that is available in your communities. So the impacts of disasters on communities. So first, we want to focus on the more of the macro, the bigger picture impacts of crisis and disasters, and then we'll move into the individual one. So the effects of disasters, it is disruptive to the social and communication infrastructure. Sometimes there is that immediate or drastic one. And one of the things that kind of breaks down is the inability to really understand or get accurate information on what's going on, what is happening, and what are the available resources, and what are the supports that are available for community members. And when I talk about community, it could be that school community, it could be the bigger community. Diminished coping and resources and social supports. These are definitely challenged in times of crisis. Depleted or destroyed households, and sometimes this is, literal in terms of households, like homes being destroyed and not having anything. But it also could be the chaos that is brought about by the crisis and whatever infrastructure or whatever systems they have in place in their homes or in the community or in your organization is also challenged. Temporary and long-term threats to physical and mental safety. And again, we will talk about it a little bit earlier. There are certain groups that are more vulnerable than others, but whether you have resources per se, personal resources or coping skills, sometimes there's that moment, there's those moments that we kind of forget them because of the present crisis that we're under in. So we need to kind of rebuild or remind each other of those different coping skills so that physically, when you have your medical issues, that could also be challenged. Increased community conflicts, and again, with resources, sometimes we're fighting for the same resources, and they're limited, or they're momentarily paused, or they're not available. But again, this could mean so many different things in communities. And I think we are experiencing that in terms of access to medical resources within ethnic groups and racial groups. And so this is one of the things that normally emerges. Creation of new problems that interfere with help seeking and evacuation. And again, there are unexpected consequences of crisis that we are not prepared for. The massive unemployment right now is one of those things that have emerged due to the closure of businesses brought about by this pandemic. Schools are the first institutions to resume. In a typical crisis or disaster, school is normally the first institution that is brought back because one, sometimes they're used as shelters, and two, in order for the adults to rebuild and handle whatever they need to handle, they need to have a safe space for the children and the minors, the children and adolescents to be, so that the adults can do whatever they need to do to start rebuilding. But in this particular situation, this is kind of different as well. And so we need to, we're learning when it comes to this particular pandemic because schools are still, everybody's still remote. So it's a little bit different at this time. So when it comes to disaster, there are phases in terms of the experience. I think you can see the mouse, my cursor and my mouse. Usually the pre-disaster is when we plan to have those safety plans, crisis plan, and when organizations and individuals are supposed to have, developed and work on the infrastructure for responses. And then what happens is that the threat comes in, that event comes in. Immediately, there are some warnings prior to the event. So we kind of start mobilizing what we have, what we've prepared for, or we do some adaptation if it's for a crisis that we're not prepared to. But then that crisis event hits. And then immediately we do an inventory of the damage, what we have, what we don't have, and what are the damages. As you can see, this part of the phases of disaster, it's a little bit different with this pandemic that we are experiencing. This particular crisis has really challenged everyone's safety plans, crisis plans, because of the different nature that it has. And then usually during this time, there is the heroic phase where everybody responds. And we're seeing a lot of that, but one of the things that's happening is there is a prolonged experience to all of this. And so we see the nurses, the teachers, the social workers, the doctors, the first responders, and we have those essential. Everybody's doing their part, and we have a lot of people volunteering, making masks, people volunteering to distribute food in certain food banks and community resource centers. And then you have, after that heroic phase of tremendous response and overwhelming response, the honeymoon stage, where everybody starts working and looking at, how to rebuild. But unfortunately, what also happens is that when this first response and a little bit more of the prolonged response happen, everybody has to go back. Even the volunteers have to go back to their normal day-to-day life. And so what happens is that then the community is left to deal with the continuing rebuilding on their own. And so a lot of the disillusionment kind of starts to surface in terms of barriers, challenges in continuing that reconstruction. And so this is where, and again, the secondary challenges occur throughout, but this is especially where all of them are surfacing. For example, in the situation with a lot of the floodings, the insurance issues, whether they have flood insurance or not, there is still limited resources. And sometimes if you don't have the representation, it's hard for you to access those FEMA funds or reconstruction funds. And so a lot of families become permanently homeless, especially in those impoverished communities. And then on top of that, you're working through and coming to terms with the losses and the grief, whether it's lives, whether it's physical things and that sort of stuff. But then at the same time too, this is a prolonged time at this point in time. And so anniversaries are happening. When you have holidays, when you have the first year anniversaries, those things are sort of triggering back or reminding those who have experienced this firsthand, they're being reminded of what they've lost. And then with that, you have the long-term reconstruction that's happening. And then the reconstruction really happens from this heroic honeymoon phase, but then it keeps going. And so there is, FEMA has provided a recovery continuum wherein a lot of these things, these fixes could overlap. And if you look at this long-term, months and years after, it really starts at that short-term days, and then it continues, but then you could have your in short-term, immediate experiences that could overlap as well for many reasons, for other sort of challenges that occurs throughout that time. And with that, I will transfer it to Ms. Bona.
Thank you, Vivian. Go ahead on to the next slide. So Vivian just spoke about the impact of disasters on communities more broadly, but let's just quickly take a look at how a crisis like the one we're going through right now, how is it impacting our students? Because I think that's probably why most of you are on the call today, is to really understand how to better support the students and families that you serve. And so for anyone who may have participated on some of the prior webinars, you've seen this slide, or if you've taken maybe a Trauma 101, you may be familiar with some of this, but I think it's critically important to remind ourselves of what's going on physiologically for our students, because then it helps to explain some of the behaviors that we might be seeing. So we know that our stress response is really guided by 3 regions of the brain. The amygdala is that part of the brain that is our alarm system. When it identifies a threat, it sort of sets off an alarm, and in a cascade of chemicals and different hormones that help us to rev up and manage the perceived threat. The hippocampus is the region of the brain that regulates memory and can help us regulate our emotions when we're under stress. And then finally, our prefrontal cortex is the region of the brain that helps us with all of our higher order thinking, such as evaluation, logic, planning, organization. So when we think about it, when all of these 3 regions of the brain work together, we have an incredibly effective stress response. But we know that sometimes certain stressors can become so overwhelming that our brain works a little bit differently. And if Vivian, you can move to the next slide. So this is what happens when we experience an acute trauma or a severe stressor. What happens? Well, our brain perceives that the event is so overwhelming that in order to respond to it, it sort of fires so powerfully that it knocks out our hippocampus and our prefrontal cortex. And there is an evolutionary reason for this. When we are under a perceived threat, we often don't have time to use our prefrontal cortex and weigh the pros and cons of how to respond. We have to respond instinctually. And so that is why our brains have been designed to respond to acute trauma in this way. So we can think about many of our students, our families, and even ourselves right now, and take a step back and think about, well, we're all under a lot of stress. And this may be the physiological response that you're having right now, that your student is having right now. And just to reflect on that, to know that this might be the physiological state that a lot of us are in. Next slide. And so what's really unique about this situation and this crisis is that it is ongoing. This is not like just a one-time hurricane or a natural disaster that comes and it goes, and certainly that is distressing. But in this extremely unique situation, we're experiencing this stress pretty chronically. And so there's we're dealing with a new thing every day. Some families are facing unemployment. Some families are facing illness. All of us are facing just not knowing what's going to be happening next month or the month after that. So what happens when we're under chronic stress is that amygdala is firing and firing and firing to try to keep us safe. And so just like how if we use a particular muscle group over and over, it gets stronger, there's a parallel thing that happens in our brains. The more we use a particular neural network, the stronger it gets. And similarly, as if those other regions of the brain that sort of get knocked offline when our brain is in crisis mode or when we're in our survival brain, that hippocampus and that prefrontal cortex, they're slightly impaired when we're in this stress response. And so when you're looking at this and you're seeing that, then our students' ability to regulate their emotions are impaired right now. Our students' ability to use logic, plan, organize, that's impaired right now. That's important for us to reflect on and to realize that we need to meet our students where they are. And I will also stress that the same again is true for us. Many of us are in this mode and we're trying to do our very best work. We're trying to stay on top of the myriad of tasks that are in front of us, but many of us are in this same state. And that's one of the reasons that I like this model of PFA that we'll be sharing, is because we know the people delivering the intervention are just as impacted by the crisis as everyone else in the community. So PFA LPC is a model that uses skills that are already in your tool belt, so that even if you're experiencing the same physiological response, you'll be able to deliver it because it is simple and it's using tools that are already in your wheelhouse. Next slide.
Before I move to the next slide, I just wanted to add that if you have individuals or if you're working with students that have previous experiences of trauma, imagine that they already are in this state of stress sort of response, that their amygdala is the more prominent system that is, in place and that responds to external situations or stimuli. But imagine adding this particular experience, this drastic change in our day-to-day to those individuals. How much more stress are their response systems? Okay.
So, based on the slides that we just saw, it makes a lot of sense to expect that you're going to see particular behaviors in your students and in those that you interact with. And again, this is what those neurological adaptations that you just saw, this is how they manifest in everyday life. Trouble sleeping, sadness, anger, irritation. Again, having difficulty regulating emotions, the trouble focusing, listening, inability to complete tasks. So these are all of the things that you probably are seeing in many of your students and maybe even in your colleagues and in yourself. Next slide. And in particular with children, especially younger children, you're going to see concerns about separation, fear of recurrence, again, difficulty sleeping. And with our adolescents, you may be seeing things like higher risk behaviors. Next slide. And I really find that it's helpful to think of the different kinds of symptoms we're seeing in 4 different clusters. You're seeing symptoms related to their cognition, their ability to think and plan. You're going to see symptoms in terms of their emotions, having a more difficult time regulating themselves. Additionally, you'll see behavioral manifestations of the stress and trauma. And in particular for younger kids, you may also see physical manifestations like stomach aches or headaches. Next slide. And we know that there are certain things that can make individuals more impacted by an event. And so these are some of the risk factors that make someone more likely to have a traumatic response to a crisis. And so a lot of previous loss. There's that note about having a past traumatic experience. And I would just say that's a little bit nuanced, because for individuals who have had a past traumatic experience but have really resolved that, that may actually serve as a protective factor for them. But if we have prior traumatic experiences that we haven't fully processed, then those make us more impacted by a subsequent trauma. And so you'll have this deck and you'll be able to look through all of these. But certainly these are great examples of things that if you're thinking about particular students, you can think about whether or not they have additional risk factors that make them more susceptible. Next slide.
Pamela?
Yes.
I'm wondering if you want to take a question that we have in chat, which is the difference between distress and stress.
Okay. Yes. So stress, I would say, is the umbrella term. Stress can mean good stress, and the term for that is eustress. I think it's spelled E-U-S-T-R-E-S-S. And those could be things like, I'm moving into a new home that I'm excited about, or somebody's going to be getting married and they have some stress associated with that. We consider that good stress or eustress. And then distress is the more negative kinds of things that we think about. Now, distress really exists on a spectrum, and we can think of more moderate stress as distress. Like for an adult, it may be things around finances, and it could be things for a kid around taking a test. That could be considered distressing. But then when we move up to more severe and chronic severe stress, we're thinking about things like poverty, homelessness, abuse. And then if something were to be so stressful that it rises to the level of trauma, that's when we get that really specific physiological reaction to something, that it rises to the level of trauma. So distress is sort of the negative kinds of stress. And then, yes, and I see in the chat, toxic stress. Yes, exactly. The more we have that severe chronic stress, the more it's giving us that physiological response, creating that cortisol that goes through our bodies. And that's where we get some of those really significant negative repercussions. I hope that answers the question. All right. On the flip side, it may be that you see some profound coping in maybe some of your colleagues, in some of the families you're working with, or even some of the students that you're working with. And that's because some people really are resilient, and we'll get into resilience in a couple slides, but it isn't that everyone is going to have these really strong negative reactions. It can be that some people have great coping strategies, and we'll really want to identify those, share those with others, and really try to enhance those for individuals that may not be coping in such a healthy way. Move forward, please. Okay, and so this gets to that age-old question that I often hear is, two people can experience the same event, and for some reason, one person bounces back and the other person does not. Why is that? And it really gets into this concept of resilience, which is defined as the ability to effectively cope with, adapt to, and overcome adversity, stress, and challenging experiences. And so researchers started to ask the question, why are some people more resilient than others? And on the next slide, what the researchers found is that there's these things called protective factors, and this might be something that you're all very familiar with. And I really like breaking protective factors up into two groups. When we think of assets, we think of things that are more innate to the individual, things that they don't necessarily have as much control over. Their intelligence, their natural talents, the temperament that they're born with, which is pretty hardwired, and their current level of self-esteem. Those can all serve as buffers when we're experiencing a crisis. Then there's resources, things that are in the environment, things that are external to an individual that can serve as a buffer. And really for our kids, what we want to be focusing on, particularly when we're talking about PFA, is connections, relationships with a trusted adult, that consistent, predictable routines. We know that those are so important for students and for ourselves right now. And then finally, optimism, having a sense of purpose. Those are the kinds of things that we're trying to usher in, and we're trying to enhance those protective factors for our students at this time. And that's really what PFA is all about. Next slide. And so you've all probably heard this a million times, but really the most potent and important protective factor for any of our students is a trusted relationship with an adult. And many times teachers fill that role. And what's great about these trusted relationships is they actually go a long way towards helping students regulate their emotions. And we'll go to the next slide so I can explain that a little bit more clearly. And what this means is that we looked at those other slides where the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus were more grayed out, they were impaired, but the amygdala was firing more powerfully. But what's great about what we've learned about relationships is that when we are in a trusting and close relationship with someone, it actually releases the chemical oxytocin. And oxytocin has been shown to reduce the firing of the amygdala. And so when that amygdala fires less, then the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex can come back online. And so really, this is the aim of PFA. This is what we're trying to do. As we usher in supports for our students, we're trying to create this neurological state for them so that they can regulate their emotions, they can regulate their behaviors, and they can resume learning. They can return to the learning environment, whether it be in person or virtually. So that's the power of our relationships and the power of protective factors. And I'll let Vivian pick it up from here.
Okay, so I'm sorry about the pause. I'm trying to unmute myself as I am doing the PowerPoint. So understanding the effects of a crisis. Although everyone is affected, not everyone is affected by a crisis and disaster in the same way. As Pamela have mentioned to you before, there are those who might be challenged by it, might be responding on their acute or chronic stress or utilizing their chronic stress response. But there are those who would be able to cope and really tap into their assets and protective factors as well. So we want to expect different people to experience it differently. And we want to make sure that we are in utilizing our listen, protect, connect, is letting that individual tell us and really listening to them in terms of their needs and what kinds of responses are required. What makes coping more difficult for people after the crisis? What is it that's difficult for them? This being an individual experience, we need to really explore how they're experiencing the situation and also let them tell us what are the connections and resources and supports that they might need. Building schools and community resilience, one student and one colleague at a time. So when the crisis strikes, so if you kind of just look at what's happening right now, how were schools mobilized from the very, very beginning in terms of responding and providing supports to children in the community as well as those families. And so schools have become sort of like a lifeline. We've moved into the remote sort of learning and contacts, but if you think about it, the cafeterias are open for breakfast and lunch because we know that that serves such an important connection to the community and to the children and the families that we provide services to. So distress is common after emergencies and psychological first aid, or PFA, can really help. So imagine if you have families who might not be, as they come and pick up lunch, as they come and pick up breakfast, are we connecting with them? Are we finding out if they have access to computers, access to the internet, so that they can keep connected with their teachers as the teaching or the learning, or however we want to redefine it, is being delivered remotely? So psychological first aid means supporting people by listening to their immediate concerns and needs, by helping where we can, any which way we can, and also by connecting people to other resources in and out of the school. And in this particular situation, there are so many more creative ways to do this, but especially being stay at home, a lot of individuals, particularly some families, are feeling disconnected and don't have access to things. So psychological first aid, and there are many models of it, and so we just wanted to make sure that we are that we are labeling it correctly. So this is the Listen, Protect, Connect, Model, Teach, psychological first aid. And again, it is an evidence-based informed approach for assisting children, adolescents, adults, and families in the immediate aftermath of a critical incident, disaster, or terrorism. It is designed to reduce the initial distress caused by traumatic events or stressful events to foster short-term and long-term adaptive functioning. So there are 5 steps to the psychological first aid LPC. Listen first, second, protect, third, connect, fourth, model, and lastly, teach. So let's start with listening. Listen is the first step. Before helping someone, being willing to listen is important, to understand exactly what their concerns are and what they need the most right now. And I think this is the part that we wanted to stress. Letting the individual, whether you're helping a child, a student, or an adult, you're one of your colleagues, is really listening to see and to understand how they're experiencing the crisis. And also understanding, letting them define for us, what is it that they need? So how do we begin to listen to someone who's in distress? One, we need to make sure that we're really giving them the space to talk about it, that they're talking more than we are talking. We also, this is the challenging part right now, we also have to look at the nonverbal cues. Being remote, being online, being on the phone with them, this is a lot more challenging than being at the school physically, where you're actually seeing the match or the mismatch between their communication and their nonverbal cues. And so what you could look for are the tone of the voice. You could look for the speed of their speech, looking for some of the intonations and some of the stress. And really, if this is only by phone, listening to how that information is being delivered to you as well via the speech. But if you have the privilege of being online with them and Zooming with them one-on-one or with a family, there are more verbal cues that you can, or nonverbal cues that you can look for. So there has to be a little bit more hypervigilance in how we pick up those nonverbal cues. And then again, observations and how they behave. I think these are some of the challenging things as well, but then at the same time, if you're checking in with them each week or every other day, you'll be able to kind of pick up on some of the patterns of behavior that they might be, sharing with you, or you might be observing as you interact with students and when you're doing your check-ins. So there is definite adaptations, flexibility, and sort of stretching in how we want to define the nonverbal and behavior cues. But I think, with consciousness, we can pick those up for sure, with efforts as well. Listen, you want to convey your interest and empathy. And I think this is explained clearly when Pamela talked about the value of that relationship and the value of that connection. I think there are so many ways to really stress interest and empathy, even via the phone or via Zoom. One of the things that I would stress is really the consistency. If you do say that you will check in with them at a certain time or date, I think it's really important to follow through with those, creating those kinds of expected sort of patterns and responses. So some of the ways you can also express interest and empathy is by the questions that you ask. Where were you when the crisis happened? What do you remember about that day? How are you doing today? What are the things that you're doing right now in order to cope with the situation that you're in? And really making it about them and not making it about us. So we have to be really conscious on, is the conversation focused on that individual that you're providing PFA to? Or are we shifting it to our own experiences? So really focusing on that individual. And then in terms of the second step, one other thing too, before we do that, I wanted to point out with the listen is how distracted are you when you're talking to them, whether it's via phone or on Zoom? Are you managing multiple tasks while you're doing that? And I think if you look at this from that physical sort of, if you're in the physical campus, it's easy to really be distracted when you're managing multiple things as you're responding to a crisis. But when on the phone, I think this is an added sort of challenge in terms of how do you really convey interest and empathy and not be distracted while doing it? Are there dogs barking on the side? Are there, whether you're on Zoom or just on phone, is somebody yelling for your attention on the other side? And so thinking of when is, the right time, the right moment to make that connection with a student, and are they going to have your undivided attention? I think it only takes that nanosecond to lose someone when they feel that they're in crisis and you're really not present for them and you're really not there and you're juggling so many things. So these are the kinds of things that you want to pay attention to as you're engaging in the listening skill. And then as we move on to protect, protection means helping individuals around you to cope, providing reassurance, support, encouragement, determining how you can realistically help now. What is the kind of protecting that they need now? And again, paired up with the listening, letting the individual really define it for you. What that means might be helping them figure out how to connect with their friends, what platforms to use, maybe connecting with family members that they have not had the chance to connect with, pitching in directly or responding where it is needed as defined by the person you're providing PFA to. So protecting helps people to bounce back faster. So if you look at the stress reaction or the stress response models of the brain, you want to calm that amygdala down and really re-engage them. So sometimes if the amygdala is the primary response system that is in place, they might be forgetting some of their protective factors, their assets. And so providing that safe space and environment where they could calm, or they could help regulate their amygdala and calm it down, so that they can then re-engage the hippocampus as well as their prefrontal, so that they can harness back and really restart some of those coping skills and tap into the protective factors that they have. Protect during a crisis or a disaster, help out with basic needs. So most of the time, so I think that's why we'll talk about this a little bit later. It is important to have that crisis plan and resources, partnerships, and networks that you have in the community, because we need to know where we could send our families for additional protection, such as food, shelter, clothing, if they do need it. Looking at the different, spectrum of the different crises and disasters that could happen, food might be a priority right now, especially those who are losing their jobs, but other times it could be shelter depending on what that crisis is. You may need to provide and arrange for first aid, CPR, or get additional helps and link them to those types of medical resources. Answer questions about what happened, get and share updated information, including key public health or school official or community emergency information. And I think one of the things that I want to stress out about this is that really having a reliable source of communication when it comes to school information. And I think you have individuals, or you have students who are supposed to be graduating and who are worried, are they going to graduate? Are they moving on to the next level? Are they moving on from elementary school to middle school, from middle school to high school? What are those markers in life sort of events that they're missing right now? So what are the communications? So I think this is one of the things, the important key factor in protecting is also having the right information and communication that you could provide. If you don't, I think it is really important to say that I don't have that information right now. Let me find out, because it's better to have those key accurate communication than provide them with misinformation, and having them and admitting that this is something that you need to find out is very, very important as well. How to protect, maintain a structure, establish safety measures, stability, reestablish predictable routines. And I think this is where a lot of parents are struggling right now. This is so different for the different states that are practicing stay at home. Some are in their 5th week, some are in their 6th week, some are in their 3rd week. And so really assisting parents, how do you establish a predictable routine as much as possible and set expectations? A lot of the adults in the households right now are juggling their own remote work as well as their children's remote work. So looking at how do we support that? Keep environment safe and free of anything that could re-traumatize. Really making sure that we are providing the safe environment where they could connect with the adults, and also avoiding any kinds of re-traumatization. And then also validating the individual's life experience. This is very important in terms of protecting, validating that their experience of this crisis is as valid as anyone. Again, it's going back to that. This is something that is an individual experience, and we need to make sure that we acknowledge that, as much as acknowledging that each and every one of us would have a different strength and the different ability to cope with it as well. Assure them that they are not to blame. And looking at the bigger spectrum of disasters, some of our young ones tend to kind of internalize it and assume blame, especially for some of the, could possibly for the secondary crises that occur, challenges that occur. So really reassuring them that, there's nothing about this that is, on them, and then they're not fully responsible for it. And protecting, what's the most difficult? So these are some protecting questions that you could use. What's the most difficult thing for you to deal with right now? Are you worried about how you're reacting? And this one is really important. Are you worried about your safety around other students, around other people at certain times of the day? or someone in your household. We know that there is a rise in family violence, community violence, and things like that when there's a crisis or a major disaster. And so asking the safety questions are part of protecting. And with that, we will go to our next one, which is the third skill set, which is connecting. Connect means encouraging interaction activities with trusted individuals, making new connections to others, talking to mental health professionals, reaching out to resources and community. So looking at who is it that this particular individual feels connected to in the past, and are they still connected to that person? Are they tapping into that connection and support? Do they need a new connection? Are they very much isolated? Is the family isolated? Do they need that sort of connection? And so how do we provide that? What are the available resources through your crisis plan or safety plan? And so how do we connect? Are they open right now? So if you do have that resource sheet or resource manual that you are going to refer to, I think one of the priorities is to check which one is functioning and which one has closed their doors. That is really, really important because we want to make sure if we are connecting, we're providing them with a viable connection. Talking to mental health professionals, this one, if you feel that there is an escalation and they need this, there are multiple resources that have transitioned into telehealth format. And so making sure that we have access to those, we have the information, the number, so that we are providing good referrals and resources to our families. And then reaching out, do you need to expand some of the areas? Is food something, that needs expansion? Instead of having just 2 or 3, do we need more? And I know that more sort of community-based organizations are providing food right now in churches. So that is really, really important. In terms of continuing with the connection, locate, connect resources to community for ongoing needs. And again, these are really important. They're basic needs, making sure that they're being met and they have access to those. Help locate missing families. And I know I've gotten some emails from colleagues where they wanted to do some family checks. And so knowing what is the system in place in your community for those kinds of things. Like, for example, in Long Beach, where I'm at, churches are doing it, the police department is doing it. And then, of course, some of the neighbors are doing that for each other as well. So help individual reach out to the faith community. I think this has really expanded in terms of the experience of spirituality and faith. Most of the churches have now moved into that or the YouTube, Facebook, as well as live streaming. So this has also have evolved during this particular crisis. So do they need help? The connection that they might need would be understanding or finding out, is their church available online? What is their church doing in terms of extending services to their members, and in what platform? Identify disaster systems of care, including new places where one can go for protection and shelter. So this particular one, everybody is really having to adapt and being flexible and changing and becoming more on the remote particular side. So in each of the communities that you're in, what does this mean? What does this look like? And how do you connect to it? Check in. This is another feature of connecting that's important, and it's really looking at, are we connecting with them regularly? Is it every other day? Is it twice a week, 3 times a week, or is it done weekly? And then another thing I think that's important to look at is the staff that you have providing breakfast and lunch and in the cafeteria where families come and pick up food. Are they able to connect? Are they communicating with administrators as well as the teachers on who's showing up, not showing up. Are they capturing someone that teachers are missing as they do their phone in or Zoom connection each week? So I think these are the important coordination that is required, collaboration and coordination that's required when you're connecting as well. Making sure that we are communicating and that we're not missing any of our families. I know that there's a significant number of students that are just schools are not connecting to right now. How else could we capture them? Keep track of and comments on what's going on in their lives, encourage interactions, activities with friends, and make contact. So is it advantageous to maybe just host a Zoom call with your class and for social reasons, not for class reasons? Is that something that's needed right now? So these are the kinds of things to consider and also to evaluate and make adjustments to as needed. Again, share positive feedback, give affirmations, validations. All of these are very important as you connect with students and adults as well. These are some examples of connecting questions. What would make things easier to cope with? What can I do to help right now? What can your teachers do to help? What can your friends do? What can your family? What can your church do? So these are just some examples of that. And you guys, you were given a one-page handout, sort of like a cheat sheet to use. It's on that link that was provided to you. But there's also a huge booklet, the REMS booklet, which is from the U.S. Department of Education. And then again, the other PowerPoint, which is the COVID-19 Listen, Protect, Connect model teach questions. With that, we're going to move on to the skills number 4 model, and I'll hand it over to Pamela.
Thank you. So just to sum up those first 3 skills, for me, what they really mean is when we're listening, we're trying to understand the unique aspect of the crisis that has a particular individual in survival mode. What about the crisis is most upsetting or concerning for them? And then protect and connect means then identifying either protective factors or other solutions to help mitigate the impact of those unique aspects of the crisis that are particularly salient for that individual. So once we've done that, another thing that we can be doing, again, it's a skill that's already in our wheelhouse, is model calm and optimistic behavior. And certainly I realize that's probably easier said than done because we are all experiencing the impact of COVID-19, but this is the analogy that I like to use. When I don't love to fly, and so when I'm on an airplane and the airplane hits turbulence, the first person that I look to is the flight attendant. And if that flight attendant appears calm and unaffected by the turbulence, that goes a long way to regulating my emotional experience in the moment, and it really helps to calm me down. And so in many ways, all of you as educators are that flight attendant. And so when you're able to show up to your Zoom classroom or engage with students in a way where you're that calm individual in the midst of the turbulence of COVID-19, you're going to help regulate their emotional experience just by seeing that you are calm and optimistic. And of course, then from there, modeling optimistic thoughts. And really the other thing is, again, having those predictable, consistent routines for our students. And they're able then to kind of know what to expect in the midst of a situation where a lot is it cannot be predicted. So that's really the impact that just modeling calm and optimistic behavior can have. Next slide. And then there's teach. And I think that this is incredibly important too. Teaching really means helping students and families understand some of the emotional experiences that they may be having or reactions to the pandemic that they may be having. So now that you all understand the brain and you understand how that physiological response to stress and trauma can impact our emotions, our ability to do our work, how we feel physically, we're able to explain that to our students and their families and help them understand, yes, what you are encountering right now is very typical in the midst of the large amount of stress that we are all under. Another way of looking at that is Dr. Dan Siegel from the UCLA Mindful Awareness Institute has coined the phrase, name it to tame it. And that means when we're able to name a particular emotion that we're feeling, that gives us a little bit more control over it. We're able to regulate it better when we're able to name it. So we can work on that name it to tame it process with our students and their families. The other thing teach means is teaching coping skills and problem solving to our students. And if you can go to the next slide. The next slide after that, sorry. Yeah, so what we want to be doing is really helping our students determine how they can be doing their best work in the midst of everything that's going on. And in the spirit of being trauma informed, we're really trying to empower them to identify solutions rather than dictating to them what needs to be done. So really joining with them and collaborating with them and giving them that voice and choice in how to manage the difficulty that we're all encountering. The other thing that we'll be teaching them is coping skills. And if you're anything like me, over the past 2 months, you've been trying to find new coping skills, whether that's meditating, whether that's taking breaks and doing some deep breathing, all of the things that you're doing for yourself to try to manage this crisis. Those can be things that you are sharing with your students. And we've talked about the importance of routine, integrating into your daily routine with students. Whether you start each day with a mindfulness practice, whether you end a class with a gratitude practice. These are coping strategies that you may be using, but that you can also be implementing with your students. Next slide. And so again, just to reiterate, this is a very simple process because again, we're experiencing it as well. We're in our survival brains quite often. And so these are skills that are in our wheelhouse. We're going to listen with empathy to understand what's most salient to them right now, use protect and connect to try to find resources and protective factors to help them manage that concern. We're going to model calm and optimistic behavior because that goes a long way towards helping them feel safe. And then we're going to teach them. And we're going to help them name it to tame it. And we're going to teach coping and problem solving. And our center director, Dr. Marlene Wong, has created a version of PFA LPC specific for the COVID pandemic. And so I believe this handout and this link was given to all of you, but these can be downloaded and printed and made into flashcards that you can have at the ready so that you have a strategy for engaging with your students. And I'll let Vivian talk through these a little bit.
So we've talked about listen, protect, connect, model, teach in its general sense in response to different types of crisis and disasters. Well, Dr. Wong was nice enough to share the COVID-19 listen, protect, connect, model, teach questions that they have developed for the North American Center for Threat Assessment and Trauma Response. So looking at listening, here are some of those example questions. Tell me how you have been affected by the stay-at-home orders during the coronavirus. What's your schedule like from Monday to Friday? How do you spend your weekends? I'm ready to listen when you're ready to share. And again, you would have to do further adjustments on this depending on how old the person you're interacting with and you're providing PFA to. If you're looking at an elementary school age child, you might want to break it down. What is your morning like versus what is your Monday to Friday like? So making sure that it is definitely adjusted and it's age appropriate. So talking to parents might be different to talking to a high schooler, middle schooler, or an elementary school age child. And in addition, just sort of like really listening to what they're saying, and maybe your next question, you would take cues from how they're answering some of your initial questions. So these are some of the adjustments that you might have to engage in, but looking at what are they hearing? What are they hearing from the TV? That would also give you a sense on what kinds of access to information they have, or is it overload of information and too much access? And then looking at the next skill, which is protect. Are you worried about your safety? Are you worried about safety of others? What are you most worried about right now? So this could be if their parent or if the adult in their household is an essential worker, are they worried about them every time they leave the house? And when they do come back, are they worried that they might be bringing in the virus, and are they worried about getting sick? So as you can see, you can kind of make the adaptation, and further adaptation is definitely required based on what the individuals you're interacting with share with you as you're engaging them in those initial phases. And then connecting. Have you ever had to confront a situation like this when you couldn't go outside your home and you wanted to? And again, with the purpose of potentially reminding them of some of their protective factors and some of their coping skills. What can your family members do to help you? What can your friends do to help you? How are you connecting with your friends? Are you able to text with them? Are you able to share social media with them? And apparently, some of the social media sites are building in group games in their apps. And so I just experienced my cousins using one of them where they can actually, there are multiple people on the screen and they're playing games. And these are features that have been added to different social media sites so that there will be potential for interaction or opportunities for interaction with each other. What can what do you think you can do to make things better? What can you do right now, or what can you do tomorrow? What can you do over the weekend? What has been helpful to you in the past? And so helping them to adapt and readjust the different skills that they've used in the past to the current crisis that we are all experiencing. Model, thank you for the courage you've shown. And again, using words and using, sort of how can you model that with your tone in your speech, as well as provide using yourself an example and how you might have done something or dealt with sitting in front of the computer all day. What are those things that you could do? And Pamela has spoken about naming it to tame it, as well as teaching them how to problem solve. Let's talk about things you can do to connect with family, friends outside your home while you're continuing to protect. I've seen so many different ways. Social media has shown sort of courage and way to deal with things, and so maybe you could tap into those as well. Brainstorming with them of ways to do things, and adults are coping. One thing that I do want to point out with modeling is that understanding that whatever etiquette or behaviors engage as you make the phone calls and checking in with your students, or engage in the Zoom calls, the students or the minors that you're interacting with are seeing how you're behaving via phone or behaving via the Zoom platform as well. And so are you always aware and conscious of your distractibility as well in terms of use of those media? Are you fully engaged as well? And in terms of also the interaction, if somebody interrupts you as you're talking to them, are you modeling those kinds of behavior as well, like how to deal with them? Because these are the same situations, challenges that they might be dealing with as they try to engage in remote learning, but with so many distractions around them. And then teach, again, Pamela talked about this, and I apologize, I did put the naming entertainment with the model, but it is for teaching as well as teaching them how to problem solve situations. So in that moment in time, if they're distracted as they are talking to you on the phone because somebody's interrupting them, this is an opportunity to maybe explore how to problem solve those situations. And then at the same time, you're modeling the problem solving behavior approach in itself. So what you experience is very stressful. It's a health crisis that everyone across the world is facing. Sometimes people feel like they're going crazy because they can't leave their homes, go to school or work, or see friends. But during quarantine conditions, when all family members have to keep a distance from others, it's normal to have a difficult time. A new schedule, such as regular times for sleeping, eating, or concentrating, or even controlling emotions. Are you experiencing any of this? So here you have just provided, normalized, and provided some psychoeducation as you're interacting with them. And so I think as you do this, and as you probably have discovered already, as you have been interacting with students, you've had the opportunity to really normalize some of the experiences that they've had, but also teach them new ways to kind of adapt to them or problem solve them. And with that, we wanted to, kind of just end with this. And again, I wanted to remind you that all of this are in your PFA material. And I would now transfer the podium, to Pamela again to talk about addressing stressful educator stress.
Yeah, so we're really at the tail end of this, and I want to leave some time for questions. So, and I know that you guys are probably hearing a lot about self-care and managing your own stress. And so what I just want to put out there is that not only are all of our educators facing their own primary stressors, and here they are, a few listed, and I'm sure there's many, many more. We also know that there's the impact of secondary traumatic stress. We know that many of our kids are now at home indefinitely in situations where they are more unsafe. We know they may be experiencing abuse and neglect, and that absolutely may be weighing on us. Next slide. So really, you're hearing a lot about the need for self-care, and I really want to transition the conversation of self-care from it's this luxury that we're able to utilize when we have some free time. Instead, I want us to be thinking about self-care in the same way we're thinking about physical immunity. Every day we turn on the TV and we're hearing all of this talk about how do we boost our immunity to this virus. Well, I think there needs to be a parallel discussion that's saying, how are we boosting our psychological immunity from the stress that's being caused by this virus? And so these are strategies that we need to be using. They are an imperative to improve our psychological immunity during this time. And so thinking about all of the things that impact our physical, intellectual, environmental, all of these domains, what are we doing to take care of ourselves in each of these domains? Next slide. And again, I think the more we're able to identify the things that prevent us from engaging in these self-care activities, then we're more likely to actually have the time to engage in them if we're able to overcome those barriers. And things like having a virtual support group, setting realistic goals, maybe even setting a contract with someone Those are the things that are going to make you more likely to engage in those practices that will boost your psychological immunity, and then most importantly, then allow you to deliver PFA, LPC in a way where you can really listen with empathy and connect and really be a supportive model for your students. And so that is why I think self-care fits into this discussion of PFA, LPC, because if we're not taking care of ourselves, then we're not going to be able to implement PFA, LPC in a way that's most impactful. And so I'll just quickly say that for us, PFA, LPC fits into a larger trauma responsive school system where you have trauma-informed strategies across a number of domains, and all of those trauma-informed strategies align with SAMHSA's key principles of trauma-informed practices. So at this time, everything that you're doing, you really want to be thinking about safety, trust, empowerment. All of these factors go a long way to supporting our students.
So another thing that we wanted to stress is that PFA is not a standalone intervention or support. So it should be part of your bigger school safety and crisis planning. I think, you know, when you're connecting, you need to have that resources that you have pre-established relationships with. What we're finding out is different schools and different communities are at different levels in their planning. Some have very well established crisis and safety plan, some don't. So I think this is an opportunity to have those conversations. So we've provided different resources, and I'm sorry that they are California centric, just because this is a lot of our interactions. Both of us are from California, but we also have the U.S. Department of Education. And also something to think about on a more, you know, immediate basis is what is the messaging, the communication that you have out there. This is an example of a school's messaging in the email from their support services staff that they send out. It's very simple. They have numbers, they have hours, and they have all the major hotlines and crisis lines that family can use. And so just to source it, this is from one of our partners, Anaheim Union High School District. And so she was nice enough to give me permission to do this. And so you have to consider too, what are those messagings, whether it's via text or email that you're sending to the family so that they have immediate access to important numbers and resources. And with that, we want to thank all of you and hand it back over for questions, feedback, and to Kelsey.
All right, thank you both very much for what was a very timely, very relevant presentation with that you both presented with such clarity and provided excellent resources. I know there are folks that are taking things away from the presentation today and taking them, you know, right back to the students and the adults that they're working with. So thank you both so much. We are at the tail end. We might have time for 1 or 2 questions. So as I'm giving folks a chance to put those in the Q&A, now would be a good time for me to remind you that Megan has put the evaluation in the chat box, and we would really appreciate it if you just took a few moments and completed that for our evaluation purposes. And Vivian, if you want to go to the next slide, just want to remind people that we're wrapping up this excellent 6-part series that we've been doing with Pamela and Vivian. And again, recap those webinars, let you know where you can watch the rest of the recordings, and let you know in the next couple of days we'll have this recording up as well. Next slide. And a quick reminder also about our well-being series. We still have several other live presentations that we're doing for educators, for parents, for school leaders. So we welcome you to join those series. If you're from Region 10, Alaska, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. We represent your school mental health team for the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. So we welcome you to reach out to us in any way that you would like to. And I haven't seen any questions come in. So with that, we will end the presentation. We will keep the room open because I know some of you are still trying to navigate to the evaluation as well as copy some of the other links. And just a reminder that we do have, we have posted all the materials on the Creating Trauma Responsive Schools webinar series page. All right, thank you again to Vivian and Pamela. One last wave to everyone. Thank you for all that you do, and we'll talk to you all soon.
Great. Thank you. Bye.